Czechoslovakia had been occupied by Germany by the time World War II began in September 1939, but some advanced Czech tank designs from the 1930s made their mark on the war while in German service. By 1939, around 10% of all German tanks were of Czech origin. Germany seized or produced roughly 1,700 Czech-designed tanks, and thousands of more German tanks were based on Czech models. As of the late 19th century, Czechoslovakia, which was under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, was quite industrialized, especially in the region of Bohemia. During World War I, Czech companies gained experience in arms production and built a few armored cars for Austria-Hungary. After Czechoslovakia gained independence in the wake of World War I, they obtained their first tanks, the FT-17s, from France. By the 1920s and 30s, Czechoslovakia realized the need to modernize their tank force. So, they built up their industry and began large-scale domestic tank production in the 1930s. In 1935, a competition was held between two Czech arms companies, Škoda and CKD, to design a new light tank. A new tank was needed to replace the LTVZ-34. The Škoda design won and was designated as the LTVZ-35. The 10.5-ton LT-35 had 25mm of frontal armor, a 37mm cannon, and two 7.92mm machine guns. The 37mm gun was the same one used in the LT-34 design. It could penetrate 45mm of vertical armor at a 500-meter range, or 25mm of armor sloped at 30 degrees at 500 meters. It used a 4-cylinder engine of 120 horsepower, propelling the tank up to 21 miles per hour. Additionally, there were 3 crew members: the driver, the hull gunner/radio operator, and the commander in the turret. In the Czech design, the commander was overburdened because he had to aim, load, and fire the gun while issuing orders to his crew and maintaining awareness of his surroundings. A significant innovation with this tank was the pneumatic steering system, which used compressed air to mechanically assist with steering and changing gears. This made operating the tank much easier for the driver. However, this system was prone to malfunctioning in cold weather, which gave German crews trouble during winter operations in the Soviet Union. For additional steering support, the suspension consisted of 4 pairs of bogie wheels on each side, plus an additional wheel at the front of the tank. The forward wheel helped maintain the tank's course while driving. Finally, the tank's armor was quite standard for the time. The turret had 25mm of armor on the front and 15mm on the sides and rear. The hull had 25mm of frontal armor, 16mm on the side, and 19mm on the rear. The additional armor on the rear was used to defend against flanking attacks. Production of the LTVZ-35 began in October of 1935, and the first tanks entered service in mid-1936. Unfortunately, many LT-35s had problems with the electrical system, so they had to be returned to the factories and repaired. Eventually, initial mechanical issues were sorted out, and by the end of 1938, Czechoslovakia had 298 LT-35s in service. An additional 126 had been produced and exported to Romania, and another 10 had been sold to Bulgaria, for a total of 434 produced from 1935 to 1939. LT-35s first saw action in Czech service when radical Sudeten Germans rebelled in the Sudetenland in September 1938. Nazis in the Sudetenland wanted the region to be incorporated into Germany, but LTVZ-35s helped suppress the rebellion. Later, when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939, they seized 244 LT-35s. Germany was keen on capturing and using these tanks because they did not have as advanced an industry as their adversaries, Britain and France, and they wanted more tanks. In German service, they were renamed to Panzer 35Ts. The newly established pro-German Slovak Republic which emerged after Germany occupied western Czechoslovakia, seized the remaining tanks. In Slovak service, they were used to fight the Hungarians during the brief Slovak-Hungarian War in March 1939. Germany modified the Panzer 35 slightly, but did not resume its production due to the mechanical unreliability of the pneumatic steering system. Some major modifications included an enlarged turret for a fourth crew member and a modernized radio. The Panzer 35T first saw action in German service during their invasion of Poland in September 1939. 77 tanks broke down due to mechanical issues and were repairable, but only 7 had been knocked out completely. Panzer 35s made up a large portion of the tanks used in the Battle of France. They performed quite well against heavier French and British tanks due to their superior maneuverability. The additional crew member made the German commander's job much easier. This gave German crews a great advantage over French crews, for French tanks often had only 2 or 3 crew members. By the end of the campaign, 62 completely lost. In June of 1941, 160 Panzer 35s took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. By the end of 41, nearly all of them had been lost. The Panzer 35 could take out Soviet light tanks, but had some trouble against medium and heavy tanks. Therefore, they were withdrawn from German service in early 1942 due to inadequate armor and firepower, with the remaining few being sold to Romania. In Romanian service, they were designated as R2s and were used on the front lines until 1944. To put the tanks to better use, the Romanians converted some Panzer 35s into tank destroyers by replacing the 37mm turret with a large cannon. Finally, the last major usage of the Panzer 35T came in 1944, in which Slovakia used them to crush the Slovak National Uprising, which was a partisan uprising against Nazi rule. Overall, the Panzer 35T was a useful addition to the German army, but it became obsolete in 1941 and 1942 and suffered from some serious mechanical issues in cold weather. The LTVZ-35 proved to be a capable machine for Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s, but the country wanted to rapidly expand and modernize its army after facing German aggression in 1938. The new LTVZ-38 was largely based off of the LTVZ-35, which had similar armor, speed, and firepower. Czechoslovakia was only able to produce 10 LTVZ-38s by the time Germany invaded the rest of the country in March 1939, and they had never entered service in the Czech army. A German delegation to investigate Czechoslovak industry and weapon designs in 1939 immediately became impressed by the LTVZ-38 design, so they seized the 10 tanks Czechoslovakia had produced. Germany put the new tanks into service in the German army, designating them as Panzer 38Ts. At the same time, the Panzer 38T was superior to the existing German Panzer I and Panzer II, and was on par with the German Panzer III. The Panzer 38T featured angled armor above the transmission, providing better protection. Also, the armor in the front of the transmission had a rectangular hatch that provided easy access for maintenance. Like the Panzer 35, the Panzer 38 had riveted armor. This made production very cheap and did not require skilled workers. However, when hit, there was a risk that the rivets could become loose and fly around the inside of the tank, injuring the crew and the tank components. Czech designers had originally intended the tank to be operated by a crew of 3, but this meant that the man in the turret would be overburdened with commanding the crew, loading the gun, and firing the gun. To alleviate this issue, the Germans used a 4-man crew instead. The commander would operate the gun, but would be assisted by a loader. In contrast, the Panzer III had 5 crew members, but it was impossible to fit 5 crew members in the smaller Panzer 38T. The commander and gunner worked in the turret. In the hull, the driver and radio operator had small vision ports protected by thick bulletproof glass. In addition, each crew member was issued a gas mask. One major modification the Germans made was the addition of smoke grenade launchers. The launching system was placed in the rear of the tank. There were 5 total grenades, and the commander could activate one using a switch in the turret. Armor on the tank was on par with early versions of the Panzer III, namely, the front glacis was 12 mm thick, the hull front was 25 mm thick, and the lower hull was 15 mm thick. All parts of the frontal hull were angled to enhance armor protection. The side armor was 15 mm thick, and the rear was 10 mm thick. The turret had the same armor as the hull, with 25 mm on the front and 15 mm on the sides. For maneuverability, a 125 horsepower 6-cylinder engine propelled the Panzer 38T to a maximum speed of 26 miles per hour on roads and 11 miles per hour off-road. The Czechs used a 37 mm cannon on the tank, which could fire 15 rounds per minute. The Germans kept the gun, but altered the type of ammunition. The Czech shell could penetrate 28 mm of 30-degree angled armor at 600 meters. Not only was the penetration performance lackluster, but the shell produced an immense quantity of smoke when fired, obscuring the vision of the driver and commander. The Germans introduced a new type of ammunition shortly after invading Czechoslovakia. The new shell had a higher muzzle velocity and increased explosive mass, and it could penetrate 41 mm of 30-degree sloped armor at 600 meters. To further improve ballistic performance, Germany introduced an effective tungsten cored round in mid-1941. With a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second, it could penetrate 64 millimeters of 30-degree sloped armor at 100 meters of range. These rounds could penetrate T-34 armor within ranges of a few hundred meters, but due to the scarcity of tungsten, they were not issued in large quantities. Their superior firepower compared to the Panzer I and Panzer II made them useful when engaging enemy armor. They were also fast and easy to drive, making them useful for blitzkrieg encirclement tactics. In addition, two Czech ZB VZ-37 7.92mm machine guns were fitted on the tank, one used by the radio operator in the hull, and one operated by the commander in the turret. For increased anti-infantry protection, an MP-40 was issued to the crew. Finally, the Germans improved the radio capabilities of the Panzer 38T by installing up-to-date German radios. Command tanks were equipped with longer-range radios. This enabled command vehicles to communicate with the German Air Force so that the Army and Air Force could work in tandem. The other difference between ordinary and command tanks was that the latter did not have a hull machine gun, but had two additional MP-40s for the crew instead. To maintain the competitive design of the Panzer 38, Germany made multiple modifications over the years. The A variant, of which 150 were made, had 4 crew members and the improved radio. Versions B, C, and D were produced during 1940 with very small modifications between the designs. The D version had partly bolted and partly welded armor, and the frontal armor itself was upgraded from 25mm to 30mm. 525E and F variants were produced from late 1940 to late 1941 and had 50mm of frontal armor, which was similar to what modern Panzer IIIs had by this time. They achieved this improved armor by riveting two 25mm plates together on the front. Also, the side armor was increased to 30mm. The most produced variant, the version G, used more welding than bolts, which strengthened the quality of the armor. 321 were produced from the autumn of 1941 to the summer of 1942. Production of the Panzer 38T stopped in 1942, but its legacy lived on until the end of the war. German designers were so impressed by the chassis that they continued to make use of it. The 4 distinct large road wheels were easy to produce from a manufacturing standpoint compared to the other complex suspension systems of the time, such as the interlocking road wheels of the Panther and Tiger tanks. Under German occupation, Czech industry produced 6,500 Panzer 38 chassis, which were used to make tank destroyers. A well-known example is the Jagdpanzer 38T, which used a Panzer 38T chassis with a new armored casemate. This tank destroyer was particularly useful to Germany in 1944 due to its low production cost and highly effective 60mm of sloped frontal armor. In addition, the Marder III used a Panzer 38T chassis with a German or captured Soviet anti-tank gun on it. Around 100 Panzer 38Ts took part in the 1939 invasion of Poland and performed very well due to their maneuverability and firepower. 7 tanks were disabled, but they were all repaired and put back into action. In the winter of 1939, production was increased to prepare for the invasion of France. When Germany initiated their offensive in the west, they had around 230 Panzer 38Ts. They were organized in the 7th and 8th Panzer Divisions. Panzer 38Ts encountered heavy British Matilda tanks and the B-1 French tanks in the west. They struggled to penetrate the armor of these vehicles, but used their superior mobility to cut off Allied supply lines and encircle enemies. From May to June 1940, 54 Panzer 38Ts suffered damage, but most were repaired. The usage of the Panzer 38T reached its peak in June 1941 during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in which Germany had at least 660 Panzer 38s available. By the beginning of 1942, Germany had lost 176 Panzer 38Ts in the USSR, and about 40% of those were lost due to mechanical breakdowns or a lack of fuel. Germany quickly realized the Panzer 38's drawbacks when facing medium and heavy Soviet tanks. The 37mm gun struggled to destroy T-34s and KV tanks at long ranges, and the Soviet 76mm cannons could effortlessly knock out Panzer 38s. By late 1942, the Panzer 38T had largely been replaced by more effective medium and heavy German tanks. They were taken out from frontline service and given secondary roles. Some turrets were removed and used as stationary bunkers across Europe, especially in Normandy. The Panzer 38T represents the most extensively used foreign-designed tank by Germany during World War II. They were so impressed by the design that they continuously updated it until it became unusable on the front lines in late 1942. It was cheap to make and fit well with German blitzkrieg doctrine due to its fast speed. Above all, German crews praised the Panzer 38T for its ease of use.